The talk is organized by the Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies, the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages, and the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. Our distinguished lecturer for today, Kirasirova, who is Assistant Professor of History at NYU Abu Dhabi. Dr. Kirasirova is a historian of exchanges between the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Eurasia actually, and the Middle East. Her work approaches modern Middle Eastern history from a Second World War perspective. She is the co-author of the Routledge Handbook of the Global Sixties Between Protest and Nation Building, 2018, and Russian Arab Wars, a documentary history. This is forthcoming with Oxford University Press, 2023. But most importantly, her monograph, The Eastern International, Arabs, Central Asians, and Jews in the Soviet Union's anti-colonial empire, is also forthcoming from Oxford 2023. Masha, welcome to AUB, and please join me in welcoming Masha Kirasirova to AUB.
Thank you so much, Bilal, for this invitation and the kind introduction, and thank you also to the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages and the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm very happy to be back in Lebanon after a decade. So I wanted to just say a couple of words as background about this paper. This paper comes out of the larger research project that is my book, which is about political and cultural exchanges between the Soviet Union and Arab communists, leftists, and intellectuals that spans most of the 20th century. And the paper is not part of the book, but in working on the book, I noticed that the late 1940s period and early 1950s period was a particularly difficult period to write about. It was understudied in, certainly in works about the Cold War and the Third World, most of which really opened with Khrushchev's opening in 1956 at the 20th Party Congress, and the kind of the pivot of Soviet foreign policy to the Third World. It is neglected in the scholarship about the global left, in part because of the legacy of Stalinism, and also in the new scholarship on Afro-Asian, trans-regional, and global connections, which also focus more on the late 1950s and 60s, after Bandung, after these connections really become strengthened with the Afro-Asian conferences, the one in Cairo after in 1957, and then ones in Tashkent and other in Beirut here. But this early 1950s to late 40s period is, there's not a lot written about it. And certainly for Soviet cultural history and for the history of kind of trans-regional exchanges, there's a big lacuna because of the kinds of repressions of late Stalinism, the censorship in the cultural sector. This was a period where certainly there was not a lot of interest in the decolonizing world. So this period was difficult to write about. So in this paper, what I wanted to do was to really focus on it more and to think about what's happening in it and what were the breaks and continuities from the earlier period of the 1930s, when Syria and Lebanon were part of under the French mandate, and then the later 1950s period of that is more well studied, the period of kind of, where we see stronger Arab states emerge in the region. So this is kind of how the paper relates to my broader research agenda. So the search for cultural decolonization in Lebanon and Syria after World War II, as Yoav de Capua recently argued in his book, really revolved around questions of political and intellectual consequences of colonialism, including intellectual indebtedness to colonial humanism, the ethics of political engagement, التزام, and the role of the West in the post-war international system. But Decolonial's work really focuses on the conversations about these topics through the lens of existentialism and existential thinkers, and how this was addressed by the post-war generation of Lebanese and Syrian intellectuals. But other dimensions of these debates in the late 40s and 50s remain overlooked in ways that I think end up distorting the kind of intellectual history of post-colonialism and, by extension, of post-colonialism as a critique and as a field of study. And this distortion is reflected in the prominence of writings, certainly by European and to a lesser extent Arab intellectuals from the later 1950s and early 60s. And, they're in a lot of the histories of post-colonialism, the real prominence is given to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, to Sartre's introduction to it, and its influential approach to violence, which presents violence as something intrinsically valuable for the collective struggle to achieve freedom from colonialism, both in terms of the individual struggle of the native to become free from his inferiority complex and his despair and inaction, and of the collective struggle. And these kind of become paradigmatic of, what it means to, critique colonialism, and the way that post-colonial studies as a field approaches it. And by contrast, this earlier activism from the common form affiliated partisans of peace movement, which expanded in the late 1940s and 1950s, which advocated for peace, and especially for nuclear disarmament, has not received a lot of attention because it sits in tension with that emphasis in part on violence. And also there are other reasons as well. I mean, there's certainly the lingering shadows of the Cold War in area studies and post-colonial studies. I think it has made it difficult for historians to understand the Arab left in ways that historians are just starting to appreciate. And there have been a number of edited volumes and papers about this recently. And part of the problem, I think, is that in the early 1950s, Decolonial describes two groups of intellectuals, those that had graduated from the Paris cafes, the kind of European left, and those that graduated from the Moscow seminars. This is kind of the Comintern schools, or had some connection with Labor International or other communist affiliations. And part of the issue was that in the early 1950s, there was an uncomfortable closeness between these groups. Even Sartre, who was from 1952 to 56, aligned with the French Communist Party and participated in the Partisans of Peace movement. He attended the congresses. And this decision prompted one of his famed contemporary philosophers to dismiss his work from this period as ultra-Bolshevism, a term that a scholar, David Letheridge, recently described as an ambiguous category that really meant nothing, but which functioned in the Cold War intellectual context to suppress Sartre's writings from this period. And I think for similar reasons, the Partisans of Peace as a movement has been equally dismissed by Western scholars as a communist front. And this dismissiveness has been reinforced certainly by other fields like scholarship on U.S. foreign relations in the Near and Middle East, which has ignored this movement and its main points of concern, specifically the threat of nuclear war, the spread of U.S. military bases in the region, the expansion of American oil companies, at a time when the European recovery program after World War II made it indispensable that Middle Eastern oil be tapped for Western Europe's quick rehabilitation. So for all these reasons, this peace movement remained marginal in most recent histories of the region, including histories of populist movements here. And I think part of the discomfort that is that this emphasis in the historiography and post-colonial studies on the in Cold War studies on the post-1956 period leaves intact a kind of general Eurocentrism in the dominant chronology and also geographies of scholarship on the global left. For many prominent leftists like Sartre, also Aimé Césaire, the 1956 year marked a rupture with communism, and this has to do with disillusionment after Khrushchev's secret speech, and also the Soviet invasion of Hungary, which for Sartre was kind of the final straw, which then helped to recast their later works after their break as acceptable to scholars in European and American academies, even though many of the themes that they were talking about after 1956 were consonant with the themes that they had elaborated earlier. And one of these themes, as Lethbridge recently stressed, was for Sartre, for example, the ambivalence about the role of violence in politics. But for the Lebanese and Syrian peace activists, Soviet military action in Europe mattered much less than other regional events, like the 1952 revolution in Egypt, which ended up bringing Egypt and Lebanon closer together, the 1953 coup in Iran, which consolidated the Shah's authoritarian regime and exposed the Soviet Union's reluctance to intervene on behalf of Prime Minister Mossadegh and to protect the Iranian left. It certainly mattered less than the Bandung Conference of 1955, which spurred the emergence of the Afro-Asian movement and the later non-aligned movements. It definitely mattered less than the Suez Crisis, which in 1956 gave Arabs an experience of victory against colonial military challenges, thanks in part to support from the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc, and then other events like, the Algerian War of Independence, all of which shaped the peace activist world in much more direct and immediate ways than the Cold War in Europe. And I think the Lebanese and Syrian peace activist perspectives on their own history, the movement's regional and international networks, and the political context of their grassroots advocacy, if we look at them more closely, they challenge the dominant chronology of the histories of the global left, of post-colonial studies, and illuminate their Eurocentric assumptions. So in this talk, I will try to explore this question of, how do they help us think about the intersection of the frameworks of decolonization and the Cold War by looking more specifically at how they about the origins of the peace movement, its various definitions of peace, the activists' efforts to build a regional network, and finally the divergent consequences of 1956 in Europe and Middle Eastern for the leftists, with consequences, I think, here for how the movement's leaders imagined their relationship with Arab and Lebanese nationalism. So I'll start with the origins of the peace movement. The birth of the peace movement has been narrated often as a story of Soviet reaction to the challenges of post-war European political order. A recent dissertation about the movement presents it as originating in a 1947 anti-Western open letter from Soviet literary figures that sparked 3 successive conferences, each validating the next. The World Congress of Intellectuals in Defense of Peace in August 1948 in Poland, which snowballed into the Scientific and Cultural Conference for World Peace in March 49 in New York, and then the World Peace Congress in April 1949, held simultaneously in Paris and Prague. And this 1949 Joint Congress established the World Peace Committee, which then became the World Peace Congress in 1950. So, it's presented as a kind of Soviet initiative, and the point I guess I want to make is that while the Soviet leadership of this movement is undeniable, the participation in it, I think, meant different things to its different constituents. So, although the Middle Eastern dimension of the story remains less visible in this largely Eurocentric global historical account, the Lebanese and Syrian peace activists significantly received important recognition in the movement and also in their home countries as participants in it. At the 1950 World Peace Council meeting in Warsaw, the Beirut-based leftist political journal At-Tariq was awarded the Gold Medal of Peace, which was the highest honor that was given by the World Peace Congress. The acknowledgement placed At-Tariq on the same podium as cultural icons from Europe, from North and South America, and Asia, like the French film director Louis Daquin, the Czechoslovak composer Václav Dobias, Italian painters, Renato Guttuso, forgive my pronunciation, and the Brazilian painter Candido Portinari. And that same year, actually, Pablo Picasso, the writer Nazim Hikmet, and Pablo Neruda, and singer Paul Robeson also received international peace prizes. Here you could see, so here is Picasso's Dove, which he drew for the Congress, and that was adopted as one of the symbols of the peace movement. And then on the image, I guess on your right, you can see in the center, you can see Nazim Hikmet in one of these congresses, and so it was, thank you. So for At-Tariq, this achievement provided an opportunity to articulate linkages between the regional and interwar Popular Front, wartime and anti-fascist activism, and also the early Cold War movement. Many among the journal's editorial staff were seasoned communists and veterans of the anti-fascist left movement. So since 1941, the editor of At-Tariq, and until 1950 was the editor-in-chief was Antoine Tabet. He was the communist, so he was a communist. He was the founder of the Anti-Fascist League of Syria and Lebanon. In 1939, he chaired the Lebanese Society of Friendship with the Soviet Union from 1946 to 48. And he was the leader of the Lebanese delegation to the 1949 Peace Congress in Paris. And under his leadership, and many of you might know him from, he designed buildings around Beirut, also in Damascus. But under his leadership, the editorial board of At-Tariq unanimously upheld the resolutions of the 1949 Paris Congress, which condemned instigators of war and those working to establish military blocs, and the colonizers and arms dealers preparing catastrophe for humanity, right? Who wouldn't condemn that? Tabet's continued leadership and his experience of agitating against colonialism and also against foreign military occupation lent authority to his descriptions in 1949 of the widespread enthusiasm in Lebanon for the peace movement and its opposition to new blocs, like the Eastern Bloc, Al-Kutla al-Sharqiyya, the Fertile Crescent, the Greater Syria blocs, which he said cover up the worst conspiracy against true liberation and national independence. It also lent credibility to his presentation of the peace movement in Lebanon as the logical continuation of the Anti-Fascist League and of the wartime work of Omar Fakhoury. So in this context of the struggle of decolonization, the continuity with the Popular Front, with the late 1930s leftist organizations and the and the partisans of peace and also the wartime anti-fascist activism took a much more tangible anti-colonial meaning than the peace movement ever had in Europe. Another Lebanese delegate to the 1949 Congress, the Moscow-trained communist and president of the Lebanese Federation of Trade Unions, Mustafa al-Aris, stressed the continuity of colonial dynamics in the economic sphere, as well as the need to continue to struggle against them. In his speech that was reprinted in At-Tariq, he presented the Marshall Plan as a cover for the expansion of U.S. military bases and a way of increasing pressure on the working classes of Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. And he described colonial agents, confining union activists to prisons and detention centers, the arrest of Syrian trade union fighter Ibrahim Bakri, the head of the Homs Hotel Union Syndicate, Jamil Anan, students in Damascus, right? So, and also crackdowns by British and American oil companies on workers who were trying to unionize. So the economic pressures suggested that despite formal independence, earlier colonial economic patterns remained in place, and the partisans of peace were therefore another platform for strengthening anti-colonial economic activist solidarity. A significant difference in how European and Lebanese peace activists responded to the nuclear threat also was reflected in the imagined chronology of political violence. So Lebanese activist statements about the dangers to humanity posed by atomic weapons often reference colonial history and World War I memories of political violence, rather than the destruction of World War II, which were more immediately felt in Europe and were more commonly referenced. So, for example, in a speech at the 1949 International Women's Day celebration in Beirut, Emil Fares Ibrahim condemned efforts of the Anglo-American camp to turn the world into a keg of powder and set it on fire, a fire that will undoubtedly repeat for our dear Lebanon and for our sisterly Arab countries the tragedy of 1914 to 1918. So it was World War I rather than World War II that evoked for her audience the dangers of the new Holocaust. And so the fact that tens of thousands of Lebanese and Syrians, if not hundreds of thousands, as Tabet alleged, signed the Stockholm Appeal, suggested that the threat posed by nuclear weapons resonated widely. And it wasn't just in Syria and Lebanon. Here, there's a famous mural by Diego Rivera that shows also people getting signatures for the Partisans of Peace campaign. So the kind of the signature campaign was popular. You know, it received hundreds of thousands of signatures worldwide. And the appeal, which was initiated by the French communist physicist Frédéric Joliot-Curie, alleged for an absolute ban on nuclear weapons and for every honest person of whatever political, religious, or social view to join the voices of millions struggling for peace. The Scottish, so there was a lot of debate about what this meant, and the Scottish journalist and former member of the British Intelligence Corps, Donald McLaughlin, described it as one of the cleverest political documents the century has seen, but that because it was difficult to find anything wrong with it, but the subtle hypocrisy, he argued, what lay in its exclusive emphasis on the atomic bomb and the government that might or would use it, rather than the condemnation of aggressive war as such. And in an effort to undermine the statement's appeal for decolonizing peoples, McLaughlin suggested that its ultimate goal might be to destroy the national will to independence. The Syrian and Lebanese peace activists sought the document very differently, and the whole movement more broadly. They argued that it was trying to actually affirm the basic conditions for human and also even non-human life that were fundamentally necessary for independence. And in so doing, were able to expand the reach to many more constituents. religious officials that participated in the movement, like the Lebanese Maronite patriarch, Antun Butrus Arida, and also the Archbishop Ili Karam, both supported the Stockholm Appeal, and they did so by drawing on religious imagery to re-articulate the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons. So it was common to use biblical references, like, for example, for Matthew, all who draw the sword will die by the sword. They seemed appropriate for thinking about the problem of evil on such a scale. So Karam's statement, for example, that was published in At-Tariq as well, sounded like a sermon, right? He said, "O God, free us from this word war and from all that is said for its sake by man, for the deadly means for killing those close to us, for destroying animals who do not have the ability to speak, for destroying the earth and all of its hidden treasure. Man is the creation of Almighty God. Will he really dare to use a weapon invented that will destroy not only cultural values, but mankind itself?" Right, so the general prophetic tone of admonishment to explain the threat of atomic war helped attract new audiences and to forge new solidarities. This also was the case in Europe. Italian communist leader Palmiro Togliatti instructed in a report to the Common Forum that the struggle for working class unity, particular attention should be paid to the mass of Catholic workers and working people in general and to their organizations. The appeal to Catholic workers received an even greater boost when Pope John the 23rd became politically active on behalf of the movement. And other connections also flourished across Eurasia. So historian Elizabeth Bishop has argued that, that there was an emergent Shia internationalism which linked partisans of peace activists between Soviet Azerbaijan with those in the Arab world. But in Syria and Lebanon, I think it helped to revive a kind of solidarity, or at least that was the goal, that had cut across religious and regional lines, in part because the existential threat was so great. And there was also efforts to try to build a regional network. So despite the flexibility and the diversity of intellectual approaches and the openness to new kinds of voices, right? The Popular Front and these kind of older communists were not interested in reaching out to religious authorities or working with them nearly to the same extent. So despite this new flexibility, the movement remained vulnerable to political pressures. So some of these pressures came directly from U.S. efforts to draw Arab countries into the North Atlantic Alliance and its regional blocs, which signaled expectations of greater proximity with Israel, Turkey, and Greece. And seeking to oppose these efforts, at the 1951 World Peace Congress, delegates from Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Cyprus were brought together to set up a separate regional working group. There were initial plans for Israel to participate in this as well, but those were later dropped. And the group was meant to have a permanent committee that was based in Cairo, and then be comprised of 5 member delegates, 1 from North Africa, 1 from Syria or Lebanon, 1 from Iran, and 2 from Egypt. And they were trying to organize the Conference of Countries of the Near and Middle East and North Africa. This involved initiative committees in Syria and Lebanon, which actually included some pretty high-level stakeholders. But part of the effort also was to try to conceptualize what it meant to bring people from these very different regions, from Morocco to Iran. Oh, here's the preparation. This is from the Russian archive, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, so the archives of the of efforts to create these regional networks and the participants. But the bigger challenge, I think, was intellectual. And so trying to imagine this coalition as a coherent alternative to the North Atlantic Alliance, Antoine Tabet in the Tariq tried to categorize these people who were living in different kinds of conditions of colonialism that were all collectively aggravated by the elevated threat of a new world war. And the space included areas under direct colonial influence, like Marrakesh in Libya, states that were under direct colonial rule, with the dissolution of all national character, like Algeria, areas where Arabic was officially considered a foreign language, and where there is protection and occupation, like in Tunisia and Libya, regions that were controlled by colonial treaties, like Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan, and those compelled to host military, land, air, and sea bases, like Turkey and Israel, and regions in which colonialism meant protecting oil interests, like Saudi, but also with similar designs for Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. And these were linked in the sense that their resources from oil or profits or soldiers were being recruited for colonial armies all contributed to Western preparations for a new world war. But these differences remained significant. Of course, Iran was included in this because of the strength of the peace movement, right? This is before the coup, and the local support for oil nationalization, which was building since 1951. And of course, Western propaganda, which was presenting Iran as a threat to world peace, another potential Korea, but stretching the regional space beyond the Arab cultural and linguistic sphere raised difficult questions about organization, about which language would be the language of the conference. And as Tabet reported to Moscow, some participants, especially from Arab nationalist parties that they were trying to recruit to be part of this Cairo conference, wanted the event to be limited to Arab people only. Some, he said, expressed opinion related to the difficulty of enduring representation from Iran. He reported they had received positive reports from Jordan and Syria. They were still waiting for news from Iraq. And throughout this period, Tabet is really the person that is reporting most regularly to Moscow, to the committee there, and he's in regular contact with them, both as a communist and, from all of his different layered relationships. But so there was this attempt, but ultimately these early 1950s organizational efforts were really undermined as a result by the 1953 coup against Mossadegh, which led to the arrest of thousands of National Front and Tudeh supporters, including many of the peace activists in Iran, the suppression of the national resistance movement, and the imposition of draconian censorship in the press. And the consolidation of the new regime with massive assistance from the United States was devastating for Arab activists as well. Like, for example, the Iraqi poet and peace activist Badr Shakir As-Sayyab witnessed the repressions while he was in exile in Iran himself. And the Kremlin's refusal to support the Iranian communists and to stage a counter-coup led him personally to break with the peace movement, for which he also composed poetry to break with communism, and eventually to become more oriented towards a more kind of Qawmi Iraqi nationalism. So, this was devastating for lots of people. In Egypt, also 2 months right before the 1953 coup, Nasser ordered the arrest of the head of the Egyptian peace committee, Yusuf Hilmi, thus undermining the organizational movements from the very regional center as it had been conceived. And the Soviet Union's unwillingness to support activists in Iran, in Egypt, in Iraq, elsewhere, repeatedly pointed to the movement's lack of clarity when it came to positions on other types of political violence that were not nuclear, threats from the United States or the West, which was really where it was trying to focus attention. At the 1949 Peace Congress, it was already clear that civil wars would not be condemned by the peace movement, by the common form. So, for example, the communist success in China and the guerrilla campaigns in Greece, right, they would not be condemned, and that it was also possible for thousands of people in North Korea to sign the 1950 Stockholm Appeal and then invade South Korea. And at the same time, the violent targeting of communist peace activists by the newly sovereign states of Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and eventually of Iraq, it certainly received attention in At-Tariq, but it fell outside of the scope of the movement's mandate to think about violence. Okay, so, yeah. So during the period, and here we have also, this was one of the early successes of the movement's courtship of Ayatollah Kashani in Iran, and as they were courting him in '52 as part of this, the outreach to new religious voices and figures. So Tabet was in the loop about efforts to try to get him to sign the Stockholm Appeal. He was willing to or expected to deal with any problems that might arise if Kashani would only sign, for example, an altered version of the Stockholm Appeal. But there's actually, for scholars of Iranian left, I was talking to someone who works on Iranian communism, this was a surprise because of, how anti-communist Kashani was even at a later period. So it shows kind of the power of, and the appeal of this movement and anti-nuclear activism in this period that was able to reach across such divides. But I guess, and a lot of this, there are a lot of compromises and paradoxes in, I think, what it meant for different people to participate in this movement. During his period of fellow traveling with the communists, Sartre acknowledged the ethical contradictions of political commitment, especially in relation to themes of violence and freedom, right? He wrote, I think this was from, it's not from '63, I think it was from an earlier period, but any ethic which does not explicitly profess that it is impossible today contributes to the bamboozling and alienation of men. The ethical problem arises from the fact that ethics is for us inevitable and at the same time impossible. So action must give itself ethical norms in this climate of non-transcendable impossibility. It is from this outlook that, for example, we must view the problem of violence or that of the relationship between ends and means. And examples of Sartre's writings about violence, from speeches delivered at the peace conferences, were translated and published in At-Tariq before he broke with the movement. But I guess one of the central differences between what the movement meant in this region as opposed to in Europe is that although Sartre broke with the movement in '56, as did many in the European left, for Lebanese and Syrian peace activists, 1956 meant something very different. and the Soviet-supported, Egyptian victory in the Suez War actually brought a deepening of political commitment for many people rather than a break. And for example, in the first issue of At-Tariq after the Soviet invasion of Hungary, Tabet stressed instead Egypt's triumph over England, France, and Israel in their efforts to eliminate the independence of sovereign Egypt and all Arab peoples, and to bring the world to the brink of a third world war. A similar stress on Suez was also present in meetings in Moscow when Hungarian peace activists actually came to Moscow. They framed Hungary also as part of as an example of a reactionary imperialist effort to destroy peace in the Near East and Europe, right? So they would focus on the Near East and decolonization and try to treat what was happening, or dismiss, I guess, the Soviet violence as just, colonial propaganda or obfuscation. The results of a US-backed aggressive counter-revolutionary element trying to liquidate the people's democratic victory of the Hungarian people and to bring it back into the capitalist order, right? So this was the language that, and so for the Lebanese peace activists, I think, the Suez victory also provided clarity after quite a bit of confusion that a lot of leftists and communists experienced after the 1948 partition of Palestine and the Soviet Union's open support for it, which led a lot of people to break with the party. But in 1956, the Soviet Union's clear support for Egypt in the war mitigated to some extent those earlier ethical contradictions. And then Hungary could also be recast as part of the same colonial effort that created Israel as an artificial state, as Tabet wrote in his article, and a state that was trying to seize the Lebanese market and eliminate our emerging industry and agriculture, threatening to impose peace with Israel and Arab countries in order to transform the cultural and economic life of Lebanon into a market for Israeli industrial production. Right, so this was the threat. And so I think in these ways, the Suez Crisis redirected attention from other types of violence, right? Like the Soviet invasion of Hungary, like Soviet military and diplomatic support for the 1948 partition. So it deflected from some of the ethical contradictions of commitment. And part of this work involved highlighting the Soviet interpretation of politics, especially in international affairs. In the first issue of At-Tariq, also after the invasion of Hungary, peace activist George Hanna stressed the potential, this is the productive potential of Khrushchev's peaceful coexistence. This was the slogan that was adopted at the 20th Party Congress. And the possibility that a human culture, right, al-thaqafa al-insaniya, might create a virtuous world in India, Asia, Europe, Africa, and the farthest islands of the ocean, which would bring peaceful coexistence among all peoples. The expansion of the Afro-Asian Solidarity Program after Bandung also reflected, added dimensions to peace activism in the decolonizing world, but it allowed for new kinds of real and imagined linkages, but it also meant that Afro-Asian calls to end nuclear testing could increasingly include the Soviet Union. So to address these arguments, regional peace activists stressed the Soviet Union's willingness to stop nuclear experiments, to fall back on earlier themes of Soviet support for independence movements in the Arab East, right? And, so these interpretations of 1956 continued to diverge, and they did so Afterwards, by 1959, concerns with French nuclear tests in North Africa, which Tabet called an obvious attempt to terrorize African people and to extinguish the flames of national liberation movements of the Algerians, which over 500,000 regular French forces could not do, and to put pressure on other African peoples. All of this provided added moral clarity for the peace activists in Syria and Lebanon. Other sources of moral clarity were that, unlike for Sartre or Fanon, colonial violence was not an abstract philosophical concept, but really an embodied reality and a daily reality. George Hanna described the stress of the situation, when a person lives on his nerves, when he loses his distinctive features and clarity. People in the post-war era are uncomfortable today and unsure about tomorrow. They live in fear and caution. These anxieties inspired a number of imagined solutions, which for Hanna meant, in 1957, he proposed, eliminating sectarianism from the state structure and from private and public schools. So Lebanese nationalism emerged as an explicitly Arabist, anti-confessional, anti-American, and anti-capitalist solution. Hanna, the following year, revisited the themes of Arab nationalism, both as form and content. In a new book, he tried to trace the transformation of the Arab from his individual and tribal existence to collective national existence, with Arabic language as the most important common denominator that would make possible the departure of Arab nationalism from its religious and racist content and place it in the ranks of the nationalities that are viable, durable, progressive, and free. So he theorized Arabism by drawing on a mix of frameworks for thinking about culture, which I think significantly included Soviet ideas about a common world culture and the unity of human society. So Arabism, he argued, could contribute to a new progressive human civilization in which no one is deprived respect as a human being, no matter the color of one's skin, place of residence, birth, or workplace. And likely from his frequent trips to the Soviet Union in this period, Hanna knew about the Soviet Academy of Sciences participation in a UNESCO-sponsored History of Mankind project, which showed how mutually enriching interactions could create a common world culture and the unity of humanity. And he used this significantly to also critique European ideas like Alner Toynbee's and other people's ideas of civilization, or specifically European civilization, as somehow distinct and superior to other forms of civilization. So this idea of like a common world culture and a common world humanity to which multiple cultures can contribute together rather than like a competitive civilizational model was something that was being worked out at the time in Moscow, and that he knew about and that he also advocated for. So I guess the larger point I want to conclude with is that for intellectuals and participants in this movement like Hanna, like Tabet, the conversations about nuclear threat and disarmament unfolded in relation to other explorations of nationalism, of civilizational hierarchies, of what it meant to construct new Arab men and women, as part of a wider search for a decolonized national culture. By the mid-1950s, obviously even some of the more enthusiastic advocates of secular pan-Arab nationalist causes like Hanna ended up cooling their support. There are lots of reasons for this, right? In the 1958, the President Camille Chamoun did not allow Lebanon to join the UAR, the union with Egypt. He asked for U.S. aid, which resulted in a few months of military occupation, right? There were tensions between Egyptian and Iraqi revolutionary regimes. Syria seceded from the United Arab Republic in 1961, which all of these things further undermine the political possibilities of the solidarity. And for Hanna, this meant returning back to the theme that he had spoken about at the 1950 Congress in Warsaw, which was this idea of Lebaneseness, Lubnaniya. So by 1966, he published a full book-length study that he called Lubnaniyun, which described the Lebanese as sharing one ummah, one geography, one history, one interest, one destiny, and one psychological makeup. The Ummah was still Arab in face and tongue, but it had an independent personality because it was, it had descended from the ancient Phoenicians. And this approach to thinking about nationalism, I think, it was eclectic, right? There was a stress on psychology that was consistent with psychological definitions that Hanna had engaged with previously from Toynbee, but also from the Austro-Hungarian and US-based historian Hans Cohen, who saw nationalism as first and foremost a state of mind, an act of consciousness. But it also, I think, partially drew on Stalin's definition of nation still as a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. So increasingly it seemed that Arabism was functioning, at least for Hanna, as nationalism's form, and then Lebaneseness was its content. So, I think it's the search for what it meant to have a decolonized national culture unfolded in relation to these other kinds of explorations, including for what it meant to be part of a more just international order. And especially for the latter, this activists continued to draw on Marxist critiques of capitalism, on Soviet development models, on both Soviet and European definitions of nationhood and civilization, and the possibilities of critique. And, in the process, the ethical challenges of political commitment remained as complex and contradictory as they had been in Europe for Sartre and for other leftists. The difference, I think, significantly is that 1956 did not provide nearly the same kind of clear break that it did in Europe, leaving the ideas of these activists and Arab Marxists more broadly less legible and interesting to Western academics, and eventually to post-colonial theorists who preferred to focus on, those who had really clearly renounced it and articulated that break. So, after 1956, these peace movement solidarities continued to receive intellectual and material support from the Soviet Union. Both Hanna and Tabet continued to visit the Soviet Union. Tabet received in 1961 the International Lenin Prize for strengthening peace among nations. And, like the European left, early 1950s Syrian and Lebanese intellectuals, concerns about progress, liberation, economic colonial dependence, and the problems of global inequality continued to further and engage with older themes and conversations, right? So there's a part of what I'm trying to stress is that there was a continuity of this conversation about, from the colonial mandate periods and the concerns about what it meant to decolonize into this period, including in these committed, aligned, often communist circles. But unlike for Sartre and those in the European left, for these activists, they continued to tolerate the ethical ambiguities of political commitment. Perhaps this toleration may have been easier to bear in the absence of the relative security of a lasting post-war peace. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kirasirova, for this very rich journey. And we have time for a few questions. Sari, let's start. Dr. Hanafi.
Thank you so much. Really, you, as Bilal said, you took us in a beautiful journey. I have first one question. Can you say a little bit more about this relationship between peace movement and Bandung, if you like, intellectual and movement, Bandung movement? And of course, Bandung movement brought broader intellectual spectrum. You have Malik ibn Nabi, for instance. You have, I mean, communism in that time have been seen in the Arab world like anti-clericalist. So it's very interesting. Bandung was including more big spectrum. This is, well, I am not a historian, so just I'm talking from my general culture. So I need your feedback about that. The second point, what is really interesting while you are talking about history in the 50s and 60s, I'm thinking about the paradoxes of the left movement today. And I see the same paradoxes. I mean, where you see put emphasis in peace and maybe social justice, but at the expense of democracy. And we see that the democracy, or liberal democracy, or liberalism, if I would say, it has not been in the agenda of the left and until today. Can you also comment on this? And I witnessed, I was a very young man on Fatah Youth, where I have my first encounter with the youth of Soviet Union and Korea, North Korea. And I cannot tell you myself, being in Syria, how I was shocked about many things. For instance, from North Korea, every time in the conversation we mention the name of Kim Il-sung, they stand up. So it's a cult. It's something. So again, peace at the expense of democracy, and now we see resistance. It's the only, if you like, agenda at the expense of democracy in the Arab world and things like that. So I need your comment on this.
Thank you so much for the questions. I'll start with the easier one. I think the relationship of the peace movement and Bandung is very interesting. You mentioned Bandung as an example of, a kind of broadening of the intellectual spectrum. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable how broad the partisans of peace were as a coalition. I mean, when you consider the presence of so many, there were a lot of religious leaders and voices that were part of this movement. And I guess part of its strength, that I tried to stress was its flexibility and the extent to which they downplayed the communist, certainly the extent to which it was led by communists, the extent to which it was supported by the socialist bloc. I mean, I think everybody knew it anyway. Or at least certainly everyone in the West did. I mean, this was one of the, in response to this effort, but also a few other Soviet efforts, right? The U.S. launches its Congress for Cultural Cooperation. I mean, later they launched the Peace Corps as another kind of counter initiative to this, right? So I think, and many of the people that were involved in this movement, like for example, George Hanna was he was blacklisted by the House of Un-American Committees, right? So certainly, the U.S. knew that this was a communist front. I'm not sure the extent to which everyone at the time knew, right? Because certainly there were these alliances with religious officials. There was a lot of eclectic language, I mean, the number of these kind of almost like sermons or khutbahs that are published that in support of this movement, that and that express solidarity with it is quite striking. And even the communist activists themselves are constantly trying to present the movement, communism, its relationship to religion as something less alienating to the wider public that they're trying to reach. So for example, like in one of these articles, Hanna is talking about communism as, he actually says, oh, it's just like any other religion. It's just another kind of religion. It's just, its faith is in science and progress, and but he actually calls it, that's how it's presented, right? So you see efforts from communists themselves to try to not kind of, defend their godlessness, but actually, find other arguments or other ways of engaging with people. So I actually think that, that's one of the really interesting things about it, was how broad it became and how flexible it was. And that's one of its main differences from the earlier populist front, which was kind of a more elite, group of intellectuals. The fact that it included also not just religious voices, but also women. So like Emil Feres Ibrahim is like doing all these Women's Day celebrations and trying to get educated women to be part of this movement. This was not something that the Popular Front was really interested in, right? So it's really trying to democratize it and kind of capitalize on the anti-fascist victory, right, and seize this moment. So I think it's kind of interesting. And the Afro-Asian movement was also broad. I think there was an Afro-Asian Solidarity Committee that was it was based in Egypt, but I don't think it had nearly the reach or the resources of the peace movement. And certainly from the perspective of what this meant, like as a Soviet historian, I could tell you from the archives that the Soviet Union responds to the Afro-Asian, to Bandung, by creating its own conferences in Tashkent, like there's the Afro-Asian events. They also have their own Afro-Asian committee. And then increasingly, when there is like any sort of Afro-Asian event in Beirut, in Cairo, you have both the Peace Committee and the Afro-Asian Solidarity Committee sending representatives and sending telegrams of support. So on an institutional level, there's just parallelism with one reinforcing the other. Both of these are, I think, also offer scholarships or have the capacity to recruit students, right? So that's like a carrot that they often dangle, and there are a lot of letters from people from all over the Arab world writing to both of them requesting fellowships, and then they're like trying to redirect them to their appropriate, sometimes they're trying to help, sometimes they're offering information, right? So there's a kind of parallelism. From the perspective of At-Tariq, it seems like more of a seamless merger, right? There you get all the peace calls, there's a lot of coverage of Afro-Asian events, and often the same people go to the peace congresses and Afro-Asian conferences, and they're trying to create a more seamless, like this is all part of a general anti-colonial struggle. These are just different platforms for doing it. But of course, they're always very careful whenever the Afro-Asian movement becomes too critical of the of anything socialist or the Soviet Union, then they kind of step in and try to defend and say, and they have like a whole set of arguments or like talking points that they use in Afro-Asian settings to say, oh no, but the Soviet Union said that they wouldn't use nuclear weapons, and and they haven't used nuclear weapons, and then they try to to kind of use the talking points to redirect things back to the like American to the actual historical usage of nuclear bombs against Asian peoples, non-white peoples, right? So those kinds of arguments actually do carry weight even in the Afro-Asian settings, right? So there's a kind of parallelism, I think, both from the Soviet institutional perspective and then from the perspective of these guys that I'm talking about today. They're just kind of, I think, they're addressing both. And they don't leave the peace movement. So they continue, for example, George Henna, I think he continues to be in the peace movement. They continue to receive their prizes even after they write about Afro-Asian events, right? So it's, I think they see them as compatible. But I think that's really one of the really interesting things for me about this movement was that it was not anti-clericalist. Like it's really embracing clerics and their constituents. For the second question, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to come and give this talk here, right? I teach at Abu Dhabi. I don't know, we don't have like an active left. I'm not really sure, what the politics are or how they map onto the the politics of the left here today. I mean, I think the American left is a whole other story. So, I mean, maybe, you guys, I'm actually curious the extent to which it resonates. I thought the article where Tabet is really worried about what would happen if there were to be actual peace with Israel and the kind of the politics of the economic cooperation. I had written the paper, and then Bilal actually sent me the news, and I was just like, about
He did dinner tonight.
Yeah, so that was. I thought that was kind of an interesting parallel, with some of these concerns, but I think in terms of the other kinds of paradoxes or compromises, I mean, there is a lot of water under the bridge between this period, and I mean, there was like, we kind of skipped the 80s and like I know the left that, your Fadi Bardawil writes about, right, the whole Islamist period, right? So there's a lot that happens kind of between this period and now, but I'd love to hear more about it from you guys.
Oh, okay. Sure, yeah. Okay. Hello, my name is Philip. So I was going to ask if you see, I don't know, it might be something of a polemical question or a kind of provocative question, but if you see in the events in 1953 in Iran some type of reason to project backwards onto the peace movement, a kind of futility that's inscribed in what they were doing at that time. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I think as a historian, I think it's always interesting to see the contingencies that lead up to particular events, and I think it's always it's hard to tell. I don't even know if it's just I mean, on the one hand, I mean, of course you're right, and Iran is not the first case, right? There was the in 1920, right, when there was an uprising, and in Iran there was the Republic of Gilan that was created, that the Comintern And this was like the height of Comintern support for revolution in the Third World. This was like the year of, when Lenin makes his famous concessions to M.N. Roy, when they have a Baku Congress of the Peoples of the East, and they're really like, rattling for revolution. There's revolution in Iran, they do nothing about it, right? And and they don't support it, they let the uprising get crushed, and this sends a message to communists in Turkey and in other places that, maybe this is what's going to happen, right? So this is there's 53, there were many other, I think, precedents where that same projections or similar projections could have been made or conclusions could have been drawn. I think it's hard to do that. I think people continue to be optimistic, right? People continued, it was the people who were involved in this movement. I think after 48, the people who broke with the movement over Palestine, and for whom 56 wasn't really enough, who still felt betrayed, like Raif Khouri, I know his daughter teaches here. I was talking to her, and she told me even, in 67, like he was still expecting the Soviet Union to come and intervene, right? So I think it's hard to kind of draw these, or to make these kinds of projections. But I think for the people themselves, they didn't do that, right? There was a lot of hope, there was a lot of optimism, and and it was a different time, right? Like decolonization had started, it was happening. European power was being challenged and was shrinking. I think people weren't quite sure what U.S. presence in the world was going to be yet. So I think it was hard to tell, and I think that's why people were as crushed as they were and as disappointed as they were. At the time, but certainly, yeah, it's I think, there's that example. There are many others where similar, I think, conclusions could be made.
Questions? Thank you, Dr. Masha.
Thank you. Thank you.